So the purpose of this panel discussion tonight begins with compassion and empathy for the widespread devastation suffered by Puerto Rico following back-to-back hurricanes of Irma and Maria in September 2017. Maria, a Category 4 storm, created an unprecedented catastrophe for the island's population of 3.3 million American citizens. An estimated 2,975 people were killed. The death toll may climb higher. More than 1 million homes and buildings were damaged. More than 80% of the island's crops destroyed. It took nearly 1 year for the Puerto Rico Electric Power Authority to restore power to its customers, and parts of the island remain without power or basic services. Billions of dollars of damage crushed an already fragile economy, suffering an economic crisis before the hurricanes, and the devastation accelerated the exodus and doubled the average number of people leaving Puerto Rico to 150,000 in 2018 alone. So why are we here tonight? And what can we do to help? First of all, we can make a cash contribution. It's really easy. I'll show you how. Reaching into my wallet, $20 bill. And there's a container here. There was some in back. It's really easy to ignore these, but I'm going to walk it down. We're going to pass this around and try to fill it up. I'll explain the two organizations we're trying to help tonight. We're raising money for two relief organizations that were recommended by our UAlbany students and staff who worked directly with them earlier this month during volunteer relief efforts in Puerto Rico. Those groups are Relief for PR and the Mayagueza Association of People with Impediments, or AMPI, which works to improve the quality of life of adults with intellectual impairments who live on the west coast of the island. Please join me in filling those canisters. You can also go online, make a contribution. It's all there on our website. Secondly, what we could do is follow the examples of service, selflessness, and sacrifice embodied in more than 100 UAlbany student and staff volunteers who traveled on 4 separate missions to aid recovery efforts in Puerto Rico. They gave up their summer vacation, their winter break. They rebuilt a collapsed footbridge that reconnected 2 small neighboring communities. They rebuilt damaged roofs. They cleaned up debris on a farm. They painted and repaired damaged homes. They were part of more than 400 students from throughout the SUNY system who traveled as volunteers to assist the people of Puerto Rico. What our students also provided, perhaps most importantly, was a strong sense of love and compassion for hundreds of families who had lost hope. They had witnessed their own government neglect them. Our students and staff volunteers restored dignity to countless lives, and their humanitarian gesture cut both ways. Many of our students use the term life-changing to describe the effect their time in Puerto Rico had on them. I'd also invite you to take one of the flyers on the back table in the lobby that describes the work of NY Capital Region for Vieques. We have members of the group with us tonight. This local support group formed after the devastation of Hurricane Maria. It's raising funds along with Centro Civico to convert a 19th century Spanish fort on Vieques, an island off the east coast of Puerto Rico with a population of 10,000 American citizens. They're working to turn it into a 21st century solar-powered hurricane refuge with a large-scale solar array, water purification system, refrigeration for medications, satellite phones, and other disaster preparedness equipment. You can learn more on their Facebook page, NY Capital Region for Vieques. Finally, the purpose of bringing this panel of experts is to raise awareness, to educate ourselves, and to learn the lessons of Hurricane Maria. to ask some tough questions and to share knowledge about how we might try to mitigate the devastation of future large-scale disasters. We'll begin with two of our panelists who will make presentations to put the crisis in perspective. Then we'll introduce the rest of our panelists and begin the discussion. So our first speaker, panelist Dr. Avidan Rodriguez, president of the University of Albany. Dr. Rodriguez was born in Arecibo, Puerto Rico, and he's made multiple trips to the island on relief missions after Hurricane Maria as co-chair of SUNY's Puerto Rico Task Force. He also previously directed the Disaster Research Center at the University of Delaware and has done extensive research and scholarly writing on the socio-economic impacts of disasters on Puerto Rico. Please welcome UAlbany President Dr. Avidan Rodriguez.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you so very much for time blends in. Thank you so very much for being here and joining us. Thank you so very much, Paul, as well, for putting this together, and to the sponsors of this event. Again, thank you. Muchísimas gracias. Paul talked about the impacts of Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico, and you've read a lot about that, and we will be discussing that throughout the panel. My role here today is to set the context for the conversation that will take place later on. And as you know, the impact and outcomes of Hurricane Maria were devastating for the population of 3.3 million American citizens and their communities throughout the island. There is no doubt that an event of this magnitude will be devastating for an island such as Puerto Rico, as well as any other geographic areas. However, the impact of Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico also needs to be understood within the demographic, social, economic, and political context in which it occurred. It is important to highlight that disasters are socially constructed events. As such, a number of factors unrelated to the natural hazard itself contributed to or exacerbated the disaster situation in Puerto Rico. Prior to Hurricane Maria, the island was already characterized by a severe economic crisis with major structural problems, including a massive debt, the result of a series of events that began escalating in 2006. I would like to highlight three major factors that were already in play before Hurricane Maria impacted Puerto Rico, which resulted in the quote-unquote optimal conditions demographically, socially, and economically to create what my colleagues and I call quote-unquote, the perfect storm in our 2017 book, which focuses on population, migration, and socioeconomic income outcomes among island and mainland Puerto Ricans. The storm in Puerto Rico had been brewing for decades as a consequence of very high levels of unemployment and poverty, government debt defaults, a deteriorating healthcare infrastructure, and a massive migration from the island to the mainland, among other factors. And in our book, we call this La Crisis Boricua, the Puerto Rican crisis. However, let me highlight three major pre-existing conditions that made this the perfect storm when Hurricane Maria struck Puerto Rico. During the initial aftermath of Hurricane Maria, the media reported on Puerto Rico's critical social and economic issues confronting the island's population, as well as an anticipated massive migration. But less publicized was the fact that the island had already been described as encountering a humanitarian crisis resulting from a severe economic problems surging for more than a decade. Hurricane Maria hit Puerto Rico at a time when the government did not have viable fiscal policy options, as the island was already confronting a major and unrelenting economic crisis. For example, the islands lost its credit ratings on municipal bonds in 2014. The government's unprecedented and expanded public debt, which totaled about $74 billion, plus another $49 billion in unfunded pension obligations, and a series of defaults on debt payments starting in July 2015. Indeed, the island's government would have been unable to use traditional fiscal policy tools to rebuild the economy and reverse the tide of net migration even before, but especially after, Hurricane Maria. Consequently, the federal government's response to provide assistance to the island of Puerto Rico was the implementation of the Puerto Rico Oversight, Management, and Economic Stability Act, or PROMESA, promise, if you will, signed into law by President Obama in June 2016, which has generated a series of important controversies internally and externally. Moving from the economic crisis, let's take a look at the healthcare system. The healthcare system in Puerto Rico, already in a precarious situation before Hurricane Maria, was further eroded and would not be able to respond to the critical and emerging healthcare needs post-Maria. It is important to highlight, as we discuss elsewhere in our book, that 92% of the island's municipios or municipalities were categorized by the U.S. Health Resources and Services Administration as medically underserved areas. Further, the population's healthcare system was expected to continue to deteriorate even before Hurricane Maria due to declining income and state funding, along with the graying of Puerto Rico's doctors. Moreover, the outmigration of Puerto Rican doctors compounded the overstretched nature of the healthcare industry and the aging of the doctors on the island. Given the deteriorated healthcare infrastructure, the aging of the Puerto Rican population as a result of increase in life expectancy and declining fertility rates, combined with the impact of Hurricane Maria and the inadequate response at several levels, as Paul already mentioned, close to or over 3,000 U.S. citizens died in Puerto Rico following this devastating event. Let me mention the third item and final item that I would like to highlight: massive migration from the island to the mainland. The aftermath of Hurricane Maria accelerated the largest migratory movement in Puerto Rico's history from the island to the continental United States, and all but decimated the already weak and deteriorated economy after more than a decade of a severe economic crisis. Under these conditions, the massive post-Maria exodus from the island is not surprising, which was already experiencing the largest net outmigration in its history since the largest or the Great Migration of the 1950s. And so, coupled with low fertility rates, the net migration of over 500,000 people during the decade before Maria resulted in a 10.5% net population decline in Puerto Rico between 2006 and 2016, that is, before Hurricane Maria. Hurricane Maria did exacerbate the net outmigration, which is likely to expedite the island's population decline and the aging of its population. With its shrinking and rapidly aging population, a devastated economy, limited budgetary authority of the Puerto Rican government as an outcome of La Promesa, a weakened physical infrastructure, and a complicated and complex political relationship with the federal government, some call it a colonial status relationship, spanning over 120 years, Hurricane Maria could have not come at a worse time in Puerto Rico's history. To compound matters, the local Commonwealth, that is island-wide, and the federal response, especially the latter, to Hurricane Maria generated a surge of controversies regarding the timeliness, the speed, and the magnitude of the overall response and the subsequent recovery and rebuilding efforts. Such was the inadequacy of the response that some claimed that Puerto Rico's situation following Hurricane Maria had become a humanitarian crisis which was being discussed globally. Thus, Puerto Rico's ongoing economic recovery attempts were set back by one of the most devastating hurricanes in Puerto Rico's history. Further, response and recovery efforts at the Commonwealth and federal levels failed to provide the island communities the help and the resources that they needed in a timely manner. There have already been preliminary studies regarding the federal government's response in Puerto Rico relative to its response to Hurricanes Irma in Florida and Harvey in Texas. Presumably, the federal response in Florida and Texas was faster and more generous, both in terms of funding and staffing relative to their response efforts in Puerto Rico. Moreover, more than a year following the impact of Hurricane Maria, much devastation still abounds in many of Puerto Rico's municipalities, and the social, economic, and healthcare impacts of this event will be felt for years, if not decades to come. However, the point to be made here is that Hurricane Maria did not cause high levels of unemployment and poverty in Puerto Rico. Hurricane Maria did not cause massive outmigration. It did not cause the massive debt crisis on the island. It did, however, exacerbate and brought to the forefront extremely important demographic, social, economic, and political issues that have been impacting the island for decades, but that we as a country have been also ignoring for decades. Despite the adverse and negative impacts and consequences of Hurricane Maria, positive and encouraging stories must also be told. For example, the resiliency of the Puerto Rican people in the most desperate of times has been key to response and recovery efforts on the island. Further, the coming together of the Puerto Rican diaspora in the continental United States, including the state of New York, demonstrates how communities can work collectively to provide the necessary support and assistance during recovery processes, even in the worst of circumstances. Also, the significant and positive impact of initiatives under the leadership of state governments, including the New York Stands with Puerto Rico Recovery and Rebuilding Initiative, were key in helping these communities begin to recover and rebuild from the devastating consequences of Hurricane Maria. Finally, the establishment of the State University of New York, or SUNY, Systems-Wide Task Force was one of the first disaster response initiatives led by state university system to assist Puerto Rico. The SUNY response focused on building long-term and sustainable initiatives with institutions of higher education in Puerto Rico while emphasizing disaster preparedness, resiliency, and sustainability. And of course, the University at Albany and the College for Emergency Preparedness, Homeland Security, and Cybersecurity have been instrumental in this process and in these initiatives. In conclusion, the future of Puerto Rico remains to be determined. The social and economic impact of Hurricane Maria, combined with pre-existing conditions, will continue to have significant and long-term ramifications on the island and its inhabitants into the foreseeable future. But the resiliency of the Puerto Rican people and the massive outpour of support also shows that the future of Puerto Rico is bright and promising albeit the current demographic, economic, and political circumstances that prevail in this country with over 3.3 million American citizens. Thank you so very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rodriguez. Our next speaker, our panelist, will offer a presentation on Puerto Rico and his extensive work there, including his work as an advisor to Somos Una Voz, led by singer Mark Anthony. Dr. Erwin Redlener is a pediatrician, professor, and public health activist who specializes in healthcare for underserved children and disaster planning, response, and recovery. He's written widely on these topics and is the author of the book, Americans at Risk: Why We Are Not Prepared for Mega Disasters and What We Can Do Now, published in 2006. He is president and co-founder with singer-songwriter Paul Simon of Children's Health Fund, and he's director of the National Center for Disaster Preparedness at Columbia University's Earth Institute. Please welcome Dr. Erwin Redlener.
I was distinctly honored by the invitation to join you tonight, and I'm really thrilled. And I've met some actually wonderful people who I've been wanting to meet for a long time, and some new friends, and it's just so far so good. I hope I continue the trend here in this next 15 minutes or so. I'm also here, I should say, with my Chief of Staff, Eric Greenberg, who's somewhere. Eric, where are you? There he is, back there. And especially here with my wife, Karen Redlener, who actually is the third co-founder, along with myself and Paul Simon, of Children's Health Fund, a 31-year-old organization that does healthcare for extremely indigent, disadvantaged children around the United States. In fact, now working in Puerto Rico as well. I will not be pronouncing Puerto Rico as elegantly as Dr. Rodriguez. It's a long story, but I don't think I'll try to replicate that. But let me just go back to where we are. Okay. So my purpose here is to take up where Dr. Rodriguez left off. So I'm going to talk about what I think about the future, what I think about the recovery of Puerto Rico, and what I think about the absolutely essential focus on the children of Puerto Rico. This is nothing new for me, because as a pediatrician, and Karen and I met in 1971, I was running a Vista healthcare clinic where Karen was a principal worker as well, and I have been for 47 years desperately trying to focus on this reality, that children, not the cliche are our future, we've all heard that a million times, but that children represent really the only viable opportunity to fix a lot of what is wrong in our societies. And if we don't focus on that, on the ability, the capacity that the rest of us have to make sure that children have a pathway, not to just surviving or even being successful, but to actually thriving, and this is the theme I'm going to come back to, we are going to be in a prolonged level of trouble for a long time. So talking about children now as bellwethers of a successful recovery in Puerto Rico, just as they are in Texas and in other places where there's been major disasters here in the U.S. and elsewhere. The children of Puerto Rico are children that are extremely vulnerable now, much like children who are the survivors of other disasters. I have worked with refugee kids, Syrian kids in refugee camps in Europe, children who live in profound poverty in all parts of the United States, and they represent a group, a demographic of really a photograph of what we need to be able to expect and count on in the future. My glass, as Karen points out regularly, is somewhat half empty. Yet, I say this because I've tried to focus on a level of reality that can help us, or at least helps me, understand what we're facing, actually. And it's really important that we do so. And although I am sort of a half-empty glass kind of guy, but somebody asked me whether I was an optimist or a pessimist. Once I said I'm an angry optimist, and I guess that's sort of the way it is. But so this concept of children as bellwethers, children represent the canary in the coal mine. Children need to be nurtured. They need to be cared for. And to the extent that we live in a child-serving society, which I actually hope that we do, what is it that we're attempting to accomplish? And just a couple of things I just want to cover before we get to the meat of this issue about children in Puerto Rico. We'd like children to grow up healthy, safe, nurtured, educated, creative, and resilient. This is the goal. Whether it's kids living in Puerto Rico and Morovis, which has been badly hit by Hurricane Maria, or they're in the South Bronx, or they're in rural Mississippi, or they're in a refugee camp in Syria, in Greece, these are children that we need for the future. And this is really what we have to do. And to the extent that we're not doing it, we end up with incredible problems as we're currently dealing with in the aftermath of this horrendous storm that hit Puerto Rico, and as Dr. Rodriguez said, at the worst possible moment in its history. All the confounding factors, all the exacerbating factors were already there waiting for Maria to strike that region. And it did its damage, and it did its damage on top of the issues that were pre-existent to it. Some other backdrop issues that I think are important to mention at least. So the immediate losses from the hurricane were in the neighborhood of $43 billion. And to this moment, less than 25% of that amount actually showed up, either from private insurance policies or from federal resources of any type. Full recovery of Puerto Rico is going to take well over $100 billion. The recovery of Puerto Rico, if we're lucky, and if we don't have another couple of major events in the next coming years, may take more than a decade. Could take 15 years. Could take 20 years. Hurricane Katrina in the U.S. mainland, in Louisiana, and the region is still recovering. The lower Ninth Ward in New Orleans is still unrebuilt, unrecovered. They're making progress slowly. They lost a huge amount of their population that exited from New Orleans, and the same things happened, of course, as Dr. Rodriguez pointed out, for Puerto Rico. 30% of families are currently reporting worsening socioeconomic conditions for themselves and their families since the hurricane. This is a terrible reality. In fact, some people might consider this kind of situation a toxic stressor for children and families. Stressors that will have a potential of a lifetime of impact. Financial stress in a family that's already on the edge or is just making it. Financial stress that's additional to that is a horrendous exacerbator of psychological stress and trauma, psychological trauma in children. Pre-storm, 267 schools were scheduled for closure because of budget reasons. Post-storm, an additional 263 schools had to be closed. Let that sink in for a second. It's a huge number of Puerto Rico schools that had to be closed. And the ones that remained open were harder to get to. They're farther away from many communities and many families, putting more stress and more challenges on children and families. The federal response to all this, well, there was delayed acknowledgement, first of all, of the seriousness of the disaster. It was, in some kind of a weird way by the Trump administration, not dismissed exactly, but the focus was not what it should have been given the magnitude of this storm. There was confusion from the White House about what Puerto Rico was and the Americans who lived there. I remember the president pointed out that it was an island. Thank God he did, because, I don't know, but there was this kind of disdainfulness that I felt was inappropriate and strange that came from the very top of the American government. I don't think the president and many of his staff understood that we're dealing with American citizens on the island, but we, of course, were. The deployment of the really big assets to help Puerto Rico, and particularly the military, which could have done a lot in the early days and weeks, didn't show up. I don't know why they didn't show up. Well, I do know why they didn't show up, but we're not going to go there. But they didn't show up for a very long time. And when the hospital ship Hope showed up there in Puerto Rico, docked off the coast, a 200-plus bed ICU hospital with every specialty you can imagine, had maybe 6 or 10 patients at most at any given time there because it came too late. It had a disorganized mission, and et cetera, et cetera. The fatality number debacle went like this. The White House was bragging that maybe 60, 67, I don't remember the exact, 35, some number way under 100 were the only fatalities that Puerto Rico experienced, and therefore it wasn't that big a deal, and therefore what a great job the government was doing. Well, it turns out a couple of studies happened, and as was referred to, 2,975 people were determined to be the fatal casualties of the storm. I wrote an op-ed about that, saying that, no, it's going to be at least 4,000, if not more than that, because people who did not get care for chronic illnesses died. Many of those deaths were not logically attributed to what the conditions were in the aftermath of the storm, and I think that underplaying, it's politically very important, because to the extent that you minimize the fatalities, you minimize the interest. You disenfranchise the political entities that are trying to get enough assets to do what needs to be done in Puerto Rico. It's a political statement, not just a public health statement, of great import. And the funding, of course, has been grossly inadequate. And I think the enduring image was this. The symbolic throwing of rolls of paper towels like footballs into a crowd of Puerto Rican American citizens who had just suffered this extraordinary, damaging, catastrophic event. And I'll tell you, this sort of says it all, and I'm sure you remember this image, and certainly seared into my mind, and probably is for many of you as well. So this entire reality of the federal response was an unfortunate statement of disregard for a lot of people who are very badly hurt. Down here at the bottom, there's a little footnote that says, with kudos to FEMA and ASPR on the ground, and I just want to make sure that I'm talking about the federal response, the planning, the assets. The actual people who worked for FEMA, who worked for ASPR, which is the Assistant Secretary for Preparedness and Response, part of Health and Human Services, those people were quite fantastic, and they were exhausted. They had been in Texas, they'd been in Florida, and they were moved wholesale into Puerto Rico. And they worked very, very hard with not enough resources and not enough of them. But yeah, I don't want you to think that what I'm saying applies to the federal workers, because they were really good. It's what was leading them that was problematic. Recovery, at the end of the day, has got to be humane, focused on children and families, and it's got to be fast. Every day of delay of recovering for children is damaging. You and I can tolerate a lot of suffering, a lot of important consequences for something like a catastrophic event, and most of us are resilient enough to recover, even if we go through some pretty miserable times. That's not true for children. Children who are stressed, who are not in a normal routine of life, are in a seriously vulnerable situation in terms of long-term impact, psychologically, medically, educationally, and so on. So the speed here is very much critical to our ability to protect children. There are many threats to really getting to a rapid, optimal recovery after a disaster. So poverty and the other pre-existing conditions, which the President talked to you about a few minutes ago, inadequate planning across the board. That means planning in Puerto Rico was inadequate in terms of the response to a major disaster, as well as the recovery. The systems of the healthcare systems, the recovery systems, the emergency response systems, all non-resilient, all problematic, top to bottom. And then the response, of course, because of all that, was dysfunctional. Not just the federal response, but the response within Puerto Rico was inadequate. There were governmental problems and challenges and discord among various levels of the government and within the government. It was really unfortunate. The other thing, and the last point here is the insufficient funding. I just want to say a word about NGOs and volunteers, and thank goodness for the people that go down to Puerto Rico, who are in Puerto Rico, who are showing the spirit and the ability to respond to humanitarian crises. Without that evidence of so many shining lights of people who care, it would be so much more despairing. But where I'm coming from on this is that the NGOs cannot ever replace appropriate governmental response. You know, Habitat for Humanity, a wonderful organization that builds homes for people, and they did some work, I think, in Puerto Rico too, but after Katrina, 250,000 homes were damaged or destroyed. Habitat built about 110, a denominator and a numerator. No NGO, I don't care if it's Save the Children, UNICEF, whatever it is, nothing can match the need for $110 billion. We don't have enough people with enough, spare change and time on their hands to deal with that level of problem. So while people are doing good personally, which I'm very committed to, and I've done plenty of myself, it is important to realize that the solution ultimately is not going to come from the NGO community. They're an adjunct, they're a stimulator, they're entities that inspire us, and that's good. The Children's Health Fund, the organization that Karen and I work on, has seen 4.5 million or so encounters since we started. Well, that's a big number. It's an immeasurably tiny fraction of the need. It's over 30 years, right? It's immeasurably tiny, which is why I spent a lot of my time advocating in fact, Karen was here all day advocating, I call it lobbying, but she was advocating with the New York State Assembly and Senate about things that are needed in schools here in New York. But I don't want to hammer this too much, but I just want you to understand that we love, and I work in the field of providing services for people that need it, but I never allow myself to think that that's going to be the ultimate solution. It just can't be. I have a little report card about what's happened and what's happening post-Hurricane Maria. So the areas that I've been thinking about are response planning, recovery planning, the actual response in Puerto Rico, the federal response, the response and recovery process, and then the long-term outlook. And so here's what they're getting. I'm a really hard marker, so just, forewarned. Response planning, C-. Recovery planning, D. Essentially none, but I don't know, the new students, look at them, break it. The actual PR response, D+. Federal response, D-. Response and recovery progress, D. And the outlook, worrisome. Sorry, this is where the way I see it, and I think we have to be thinking about that as we're thinking about what needs to happen next. So Puerto Rico's children, I just want to conclude with some remarks about this. So many of the schools in Puerto Rico did reopen in December, a couple of months after the storm, but the lack of reliable electricity only permitted half-day schedules for the majority of those schools. Children under 5 missed, on average, 92 days of daycare or preschool. Critically needed for mostly poor children. Critically needed, 92 days missing. And for the kids in school, an average of 78 school days, 4 months of school missed. And how you recover that in a child's educational trajectory and development trajectory is very difficult to contemplate. Kids who needed special ed services, on average, missed 97 days of those special ed services. And as of a couple of months ago, 10% of children with special ed needs were still not getting those services. And then there's undocumented challenges. Again, Dr. Rodriguez talked about the healthcare system, which was in bad shape to begin with, was even worse shape after the storm. No one's really, as far as I know, documented how many children weren't getting access to the services, to health services they need, but that's what we have. So just to conclude, we're in this constant struggle between trying to create appropriate opportunity for children, to allow them to grow and to thrive and to become effective, productive citizens. And then when they're not getting what they need, we have to do remediation, and we have the burden of economic, social, psychological, and healthcare costs. And these two forces are in conflict. And right now, we don't have enough of the left side of this prevailing. And I'm really concerned, and really the actual last slide is this. And this is really, when I first started my career many decades ago, and I was a healthcare provider, we were very focused on health, on survival, on kids, making it and not, succumbing to things that they shouldn't succumb to. And then the more we got to know the children who are disadvantaged and the populations that we're trying to serve, the more we were focusing on success of these children, meaning academically. Let them get through school, let them be healthy and educated. Why isn't that possible in America? Not to mention other places in the world, but especially in America. And then not just succeed, but we want them to thrive. We want them to dream big. We want them to be creative. We want them to be innovators. We want them to be productive in a very powerful, emotional way. And then if they do that, then they can amplify those accomplishments that they spread. It spreads like wildfire. But we have to start somewhere, and as far as I'm concerned, we have a long road ahead of us in Puerto Rico. But like I said in the beginning, I am optimistic that we can. And why? Because every child, when you talk to that child, has a glow, it may be a little hard to get to, of aspiration, of possibility. And it's for them that our work has been dedicated, and it's for them that I know will persist in making Puerto Rico what it needs to be. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Redlener. I'll introduce our panelists now. I just want an update. Somebody counted your donations. We're up to $648. Thank you very much for your generosity. Thank you. APMI and Relief for PR will thank you, and the canisters will be there if anyone else wants to drop anything on their way out. Please note from your program, Edwin Melendez had a last-minute scheduling conflict. Regrets he will not be able to participate in the panel tonight. Our first panelist is Michelle Centeno, President of the National Conference of Puerto Rican Women and Senior Labor Policy Advisor for the New York City Department of Citywide Administrative Services. Please welcome Michelle Centeno. Our next panelist, Robert Griffin, Founding Dean of the College of Emergency Preparedness, Homeland Security, and Cybersecurity at U Albany, the first college of its kind in the country. Please welcome Dean Robert Griffin. Our next panelist, Xiao Lin, Professor of Environmental Health Science, Epidemiology, and Biostatistics in U Albany School of Public Health, where her research specialties include the impacts of climate change, extreme weather, and natural disasters. Please welcome Professor Xiao Lin. And welcome back to our stage, panelist President Avidan Rodriguez. And finally, our moderator, David Holtgrave, Dean of the School of Public Health at U Albany, former chair of the Department of Health, Behavior and Society at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. Please welcome Dean Holtgrave. Now I'll turn it over to our moderator, Dean Holtgrave.
Good evening, and we've already had two wonderful presentations this evening, and my goal is really to hear as much from your expertise as possible. We have amazing community partners, students, faculty, staff who've been very much involved in the response in Puerto Rico, in the audience and on the panel. And I will hope that we can set the stage for as many of you as possible to come forward to the microphones and ask questions of the panel. So if you don't mind, as you think of your questions, your comments, please do come forward and line up. There's microphones on both aisles. And while you're coming forward, I'd like to ask the first question of the panel. And I think since we haven't heard from President Centeno and Dean Griffin and Professor Lynn, I'll ask them for the first responses, and then we'll go from there. I think the question that I'd like to ask, although it's a general one, is from your point of view, what can be done to lessen the impact of future hurricanes, and what can we do to improve disaster preparedness overall? And perhaps another way of saying this, if you had one wish in response to the hurricane, where we're at now, what would that be? What's the one major thing that we need to address, whether it's a societal issue, a technological issue, a financial issue, a political issue? Where should we start? And clearly, as President Rodriguez said, the precursors of some of the challenges go back over a century. Ideally, it'd be great to be able to go back in time and address them then, but since we can't, what can we do today moving forward? And President Centeno, can I offer you the first comments? Please.
A lot of the damage to the homes out there were poorly constructed. A lot of them were tin roofs. I'm sorry, I apologize. Generally, I have a loud voice. I was there last August for a humanitarian mission, and we traveled throughout the island. And the ones that were most affected are the poorly constructed with the tin roofs, and you would see it just peeled back like a can opener, just, cut it open. So that's something that needs to be addressed. And I do know personally that a lot of in New York City, the building trades, construction trades, unions, have all been going constantly, every other month practically, to help to rebuild and make them more structurally sound. In fact, my colleagues just were there for 2 weeks from the various different building trades to help to repair the roofs and the housing structures and so on. And they got everybody volunteering all over. When I was there in August, there was a church group from New Jersey that was there helping to rebuild some of the housing where I was at on one day. So yes, and also the contributions of people giving the monies to help to buy the materials.
Thank you very much. Dean Griffin?
So if I had only one wish, I'd wish for 3 more wishes, because it's a bigger problem than one wish. I think if I could have only one wish, my wish would be that no American should ever worry that response to a disaster is going to be throttled back or changed because of their socioeconomic or political views. That we should never and would never use a crisis as a part of political opportunism. Part of how we accomplish that, David, I think, is that the federal government actually needs to completely rethink its approach to emergency management. I would argue that the FEMA director should be a 10-year appointment, so that it's a professional emergency manager who is able to wait out the changes of any single administration or the bureaucracy, and that our ability to respond to disasters both domestically and internationally has the capacity that is maybe not as good as the military, but certainly is reflective of a level of support that only the military has received in federal funding in the past 10, 15 years. That we fundamentally rethink how we handle our disaster response and funding.
Thanks, Bob. Professor Lynn.
Yeah. So I just have a couple suggestions from the research we done for the Hurricane Sandy. I think there's a couple things we recommend for the future. The first thing is like the power outage, which is very, I think it's the most important things among all the environmental hazards after the hurricanes. So we found multiple disease is significant increase after Hurricane Sandy. So we recommend for the future, probably we should just like have a medical health or public health surveillance system to monitor the different health outcomes, especially for mental health. We found that the effect is like lasting for even 3 months and 1 year after Hurricane Sandy. So also we found the timely and effectively government involvement and support is very critical. So because we found in New York City after Hurricane Sandy, so we found a couple diseases like the cardiovascular disease, and also we found that even waterborne and foodborne disease significantly reduced because New York City and New York State government do a great job to prepare that. So which tell us the public health is so important. So the public health effort and also the early preparedness is very, very important.
Thank you very much. Again, please come forward. We'd love to hear your comments, questions, and let's go to the first mic here. Thank you.
The comment that you just made really resonates. It's preparedness ahead of time. And if I contrast what happened in the Caribbean, on an island not far from Puerto Rico, if you look at the way that Cuba responded to the same crises and the short period of time in which they were able to respond, can the panelists perhaps, if you're familiar with it, with their responses, look at how that could be applied to Puerto Rico and could be helpful for Puerto Rico in future disasters?
Any of our panelists, please.
So I don't have a great deal of in-depth knowledge of how Cuba responded. I know that they were able to bring a lot of their systems back online faster than we have in Puerto Rico. I think you're hitting on a couple of key points, and it sort of builds off comments that were already made, is that part of what we need to stop doing as a country is thinking about rebuilding to substandard standards based on existing failing infrastructure as if that's an acceptable movement forward for a community. And one of my frustrations with the recovery in Puerto Rico is that I feel that we're missing huge opportunities to move that community forward, make it more resilient, deal with a lot of the systemic issues that were raised by the two speakers earlier. And instead what we're doing is that we're building it the same bad way it was before the storm. And I know that's not a situation of what was occurring in Cuba. It's also not a situation that you see in Dominica and other islands in the Caribbean as they are working towards restoration of their countries. They're actually really looking forward to what the future is and how you build to a brighter future rather than build to the systems that were in place.
Professor Redlow?
Yeah, I agree with everything Bob just said, but I also would add that Cuba, like it or not, is it's a very centralized government, and but so is UK and France and Israel and other countries. That when a big disaster happens, there's a mobilization that is controlled and organized and implemented by a central coordinating body. And one of the problems we've had in the U.S. always, which is sort of for better or worse, we live in a federalist system, so a lot of decisions get made locally. I don't mean just by states, but also in states where there's home rule by, a mayor in a small town in Texas can overrule the governor, who can overrule the federal government. So we almost have some inherent inabilities in our country, and including as it played out in Puerto Rico, with lack of a central vision. Puerto Rico had some other problems that helped undermine the possibility of a central vision of what needs to happen. And because it doesn't just play out in the response or recovery, but in the planning for what to do about a disaster. How do you make a state or a territory actually resilient? And it requires a lot of investment, a lot of foreplanning, and I think it just, Cuba's a special situation, and we were there, Karen and I were there some years ago, but I mean, they have a healthcare system that's highly developed, and when it comes to a big disaster, it works. It doesn't work for a lot of other things, but it works for this.
Mm-hmm. Professor Lin?
Yeah, I just have a couple of things. We don't have data for Cuba, but I think for based on Sandy data, we also found the reason the preparedness is so important is because New York City Health Department and State Health Department, they put so many efforts build up the medical medical shelter, and also they have a medical vans just run around the city, and they provide 1 million water bottles and 1 million hot meals to all the local citizens, and they also have those disaster preparedness center or just I think all these things will prepare well. So that's why we feel so surprised found that even the Medicaid population, they have significant reduction during that time for all the disease. So this totally out of our expectation. So that's how us, the government got to be involved to prepare well and with the local community. Yeah.
Then we'll go to this mic. Thank you.
I have a two-part question. The first part is when Katrina hit New Orleans, there was a lot of looting and other activities done against society. I was wondering when Maria hit Puerto Rico, what was implemented to keep the people safe after the hurricane hit? And the second question is, a lot of times when there's major disasters, there's a lot of risk of disease, famine, other things like that. So I was wondering what was done by like maybe the Red Cross, FEMA, other institutions to make sure that people were fed and got medical attention and all that kind of stuff.
Please.
I can tell you that there was a great deal of looting throughout the island. And for people to protect themselves, if they were elderly, they were the most vulnerable. And even from what I heard, municipal police were also involved in the corruption that was going on with the stealing and so on. They were very vulnerable over there.
Other comments on that?
Yeah, I just want to highlight, because if you look at the disaster literature, there's a series of myths that come out regarding the impacts of disasters. And actually, when you examine the actual crime statistics for a region that has been impacted by disasters, actually criminal activity is significantly diminished following the aftermath of a disaster event. That can be said for Hurricane Katrina, that could be said in the Gulf Coast, that could be said for Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico, that typically what happens is actually that communities do come together and they help each other, they work with each other to protect each other and provide the resources that they need. And so while there might be elements of criminal activity that occur, they might be occurring obviously throughout the region on a regular basis, but what we do find is that criminal activity is significantly diminished following the aftermath of a major event. And this is, corroborated by over 50 to 60 years of disaster research in the field.
I just want to underscore that very strongly. Yes, there were dramatic incidents of police misconduct in Katrina in New Orleans, and stories after really every disaster. But the overwhelming reality is what Dr. Rodriguez just said. It's a myth. It's an urban myth that's exacerbated by images on television where they just keep showing over and over again people, stealing TVs from broken down, storefronts in New Orleans or whatever's happening. But the overwhelming reality is that people band together, they help each other, they're compassionate, and in Puerto Rico that is particularly the case. Now, did materials and goods disappear between the dock and the village? Yes, they did. Were there some officials that took some of the stuff home that should have been distributing? Of course, and that happens, not of course, but it did happen, and it happens in other disasters. But do not mistake this for the overwhelming reality of kindness, compassion, and helping one's neighbors that happen all over the island of Puerto Rico.
Thank you. We'll go over here and then we'll alternate microphones and go back and forth.
Okay.
Oh.
Diseases?
And famine.
Famine, yeah. So a lot of people, first a lot of people with chronic illnesses had a lot of trouble getting the ongoing care they need, people with diabetes and heart disease. And that's one of the reasons that the initial death toll of whatever it was, 67, were the people that were actually drowned or hit by debris or whatever, they died, and that was clear. But the much larger number of the people who died in the aftermath that brought it up to 3,000, you said may go much higher, that had to do with people with chronic illnesses who either developed those chronic illnesses, had exacerbations of them, couldn't get the medicines, couldn't get dialysis and all of that. So those kinds of diseases, yes. But the fears of big epidemics of communicable disease actually did not really materialize.
Yeah, I can fill in some for disease. We do found that I think for after like disaster or power outage, that the mental health, especially like the substance abuse, anxiety, significant increase for both ED, like the visit, and also for admission. And we also found COPD, like the injuries, significant increase.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Yes, we're watching the wave of corrective action, and normally after corrective action is done, there's a preventive action, and in the new wave of doing that second wave, it's a risk analysis. So today, when we solve problems, after we do the corrective action, we go into preventive action with the risk analysis, and we look to what someone said up there, how we jump ahead. In other words, if you go to China, they don't have any telephone poles up there, but everybody has cell phones. So they jump technology ahead. So I think Puerto Rico should maybe, well, someone is probably looking at what you do at the next wave without repeating corrective action as being preventative action. And I'd be very cautious about putting anyone in place for 10 years. There's a lot of better way of doing it than one person. Because you're doing a hell of a job, Brown, if you put him there for 10 years. You don't know which.
So you're right. I mean, 10 years is a long time. It's also would put the FEMA director in line with what a typical FBI director would be. And the thought there is that these are supposed to be nonpartisan jobs that you need to have longer than one administrative term in order to change the culture or to ensure that the culture is doing what you need to do. And frankly, FEMA needs a major cultural overhaul. And it's going to require more time than a single presidency. But you're right, 10 years is a very long time, and it's dog years under the wrong person. The jump ahead piece is absolutely critical. You do run into problems, though, where some of your critical infrastructures, particularly when you start to think about your grid, your electric grid, and some of your water and sanitation, there's only so much you can do, but there are marked improvements that could be placed into the key infrastructure right now. I mean, there's a big difference between putting an 18-foot piece of drainage than 12-foot. But it doesn't cost all of that much when the road is open. It costs a hell of a lot after the road is closed and you got to dig it up again. And typically FEMA will only rebuild to what was there, not to what should be there. And that's as taxpayer, it just bugs the hell out of me. It's bugged the hell out of me for probably 30 years that I've been dealing with FEMA.
So we have about 15 minutes or so left. I want to make sure we get at least to the 5 people who are at the microphone. So please, over here.
What are differences or changes that you would make to FEMA's hazard mitigation grant program? I know right now they take around 5 years. It doesn't seem like we spend a whole lot of money on the grant program itself, and it puts a lot of stress on local governments and not as much from the higher up seeking local governments to work with them.
Yeah. So traditionally, the country has been reluctant to put money into mitigation, even though study after study after study will show you that for every dollar of mitigation, you're saving $8 to $10 of future pain. It gets to, I think, a fundamental problem in our grant system. I'll also tell you that after 9/11, we shifted all of the attention from our own critical infrastructure and emergency preparedness into counterterrorism. And even, I mean, I can tell you that in my last days at Homeland Security, one of the things I said to Secretary Kelly is that I felt that he needed to be cognizant of natural disasters as much as he was with immigration and terrorism. So the whole grant structure, I think, is still weighed too heavily towards a 9/11 model, even though there was sort of some changes after Katrina. But I don't think it kept. I really don't. And I think that's part of the area that needs to be looked at. I think the whole issue of flood insurance, and if you're living in poverty and you can't afford food, you can't afford flood insurance, no matter how inexpensive it is. So you have this disparity, and that's part of the numbers that you showed so eloquently about the dollar amounts that are returned to Puerto Rico versus returned to the Houston area or Florida after those storms. So I think fundamentally we have to think differently about mitigation. And frankly, I think we have to have a conversation with Department of Transportation and not only Health and Human Services, but also the HUD and some others.
Thank you. Over here, please.
I wanted to start by thanking President Rodriguez for putting together the picture of the perfect storm. So the tremendous economic crisis that Puerto Rico is suffering and then completely exacerbated by Hurricane Maria. I just returned from doing a work project in Puerto Rico with a number of students, and I worked very hard, and those young students worked very hard, and NGOs are not the answer. I would agree with that completely. And if $110 billion is needed to rebuild Puerto Rico, what I am concerned about is the $70.4 billion that is owed to hedge funds and Wall Street, and the unpaid pensions that are owed to the workers of Puerto Rico. And there's this group called PROMESA who can have the veto ability to veto any appropriation that the Puerto Rican government makes. What I would ask all of you on this panel, who know more than I, what do you see as a solution to this incredible problem? Because that group, PROMESA, is basically fostering an austerity budget on Puerto Rico, reducing minimum wage, closing schools, closing university, shutting down medical groups. So I don't see an answer to this until we can do something about that incredible debt.
Dr. Rodriguez.
Go ahead.
That was for you.
And this, and that's some of the points that I tried to highlight. Very well put in terms of the context, right? And it is certainly an economic crisis that has plagued Puerto Rico for decades, right? And particularly exacerbated since the 1970s, and has continued to be an ongoing issue for the island. So there's really a critical need to systematically look at the economy of Puerto Rico. What are the strengths of the economy in relationship to its neighboring countries? What is the role of the federal government in trying to foster economic development in Puerto Rico? Sort of the recent implementations, for example, of sales tax, which is now about 11% or so, which is the highest sales tax when you compare it all to the entire United States mainland. These are what the economists call regressive taxes, right? Because you're really taxing the people who are unable to pay anymore, and it's not contributing to the economic development of the island. It's not fostering economic development. So I think there's a critical need for the governor of Puerto Rico to sit down alongside the federal government and sit down with partners, economic development partners, to take a comprehensive look at what are the major strengths that we can build on. I do agree that the future of Puerto Rico is challenging, and I agree that there's been few people that have been willing to sit down and say, let's really discuss what are the implications for Puerto Rico, what are the implications for Puerto Ricans in the continental United States. As many of you may know, right now there are many more Puerto Ricans on the mainland, about over 5 million Puerto Ricans compared to 3.3 on the mainland. So clearly there's a major diaspora on the mainland that can also have significant implications. With the significant migration of Puerto Ricans from the island to the mainland, they're bound also in a number of very concentrated geographic areas. They're bound to have a significant political impact as well. So I think it's garnering the necessary political participation, the engagement, and the conversations with both governments that are willing to sit down and really negotiate what is the way forward, because Puerto Rico in the near term or in the midterm or in the long-term future will not be able to pay this massive debt.
Thank you. Over here, please.
Hi. So, I think I'm like the youngest person here. That's okay. But I'm really aspiring to do environmental health research, and especially like focused on marginalized communities. And something I kind of get myself being met with is that many times conversations regarding these people's experiences isn't really being led by them. So I would like to know how people as academics, how we are working towards allowing those people in Puerto Rico to be able to be given language and be given just the means to actually express their own stories, because like I feel like it's only from then, by just empowering those people, that we can really see change being enacted. Because as important as it is for academics to have these conversations, I feel like there needs to be placed more importance on just the fact that it's Puerto Rican people who are experiencing that, and I feel like sometimes these conversations are inaccessible to them and just like are not including of them. So how do we work towards that?
Let me just respond briefly. I think that the efforts that you see currently in Puerto Rico, whether it be by the comments that were just made in terms of engaging the diaspora in the United States and working with the communities in Puerto Rico, I think there's a lot of work that's been going on through SUNY, the New York Stance with Puerto Rico initiative, initiatives in Florida, initiatives throughout the country that have been really working with the grassroots people in Puerto Rico to really lift up Puerto Rico. And I think that the communities in Puerto Rico have been actively engaged in their recovery process. The people in Puerto Rico do not want handouts. The people in Puerto Rico do not want gifts. The people in Puerto Rico want dignity and respect, equal and fair treatment as U.S. citizens, and they have been actively engaged in the recovery process. So I do agree that we need to continue to develop and build and strengthen initiatives that build Puerto Rico from the ground up, so people are actively engaged in their recovery process. And as I said in my comments, the people in Puerto Rico are a very resilient people, and what we need to do is provide the avenues and the support so that they can collectively come together and start generating this recovery process that will be long-term and sustainable, focusing on preparedness and, as my colleague Dean Griffin said, on mitigation, which is the long-term key to success.
Thank you very much. Yes, please.
My name is Jackie Orchard, and I'm a journalism student here at U Albany, and I have a question for the entire panel. George Washington University's Milken Institute School of Public Health has cited the total death toll around 2,975 deaths, and yet the President of the United States has insisted time and time again that the deaths were between 8 and 16 people, contrary to 3 separate research projects proving otherwise. And my question for the whole panel is, why do you think the President has insisted on such low numbers?
Well, I talked about this when I was speaking, but there's a political reason why. So if you minimize the consequences, and particularly the fatalities, which is a very dramatic and important number, that minimizes the whole sense of the severity of the thing that happened and takes the pressure off the people that actually have to appropriate funds or really pay attention to this. And in fact, it takes the pressure off journalists who, well, it's only 15 or 60 people, it's not a big deal compared to, for example, 1,800 and whatever it was from Hurricane Katrina. So I think it was a combination of ignorance and political motivation to try to express the numbers as low as they did express them. That's it. But it's up to you to get to the bottom of it, you as journalists, as fast as possible, and to to make sure that that kind of myth is not allowed to go unanswered. And this is really one of the key roles of journalists that I think, did not do such a great job in debunking a lot of stuff that was coming out of, especially the federal government. I don't mean to throw it back at you, but that's...
Well, if you'll just send me to DC, then...
Hey, listen,
Can we work that out?
There you go, Larry.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you to the Writers Institute for bringing the panel and having panel members here. This goes back, Dr. Redliner, to one of the things on your report card, and that has to do with recovery planning. And back to another, looking at a question before on mitigation/resiliency, because that's a substituted buzzword. You gave us a score of D on recovery planning. I think you're a little off and it should be lower, because recovery is a longer-term effort, and it has less plans, less engagement with partners in recovery, and you're seeing the same thing on the resiliency side. So if you can speak to how we can improve both on recovery planning and engaging our partners in what used to be called ESF 14 and now in, so he knows where I'm coming from, recovery functions, which people don't even know about unless you're in the business, and talk a little bit also about how we can engage other partners, as Dean Griffith did, in the mitigation resiliency. I appreciate that.
Do you want to comment first?
Yeah, because it's I think you're hitting on a couple of huge problems, and one is that recovery of all the areas of emergency preparedness and response is the most well-known. The recovery is not. It takes too long. We haven't done good research. We've missed enormous opportunities in prior disasters. The reference to Katrina, I think, is actually really well met, because they're still in recovery. In fact, I could argue that there are parts of Florida from Andrew that are still in recovery. Part of the reason that we have been trying to send students down to Puerto Rico as part of the CEHC's, the College of Emergency Preparedness, Homeland Security, Cyber, sorry, it wasn't my name, is threefold. One is that at a ground level, our students understand the networks that it takes for a community to both respond to and then recover from. I mean, what does it take to bring a community back? The second element is that we're there to help. And if any of you have called 911 and have waited for an ambulance or a police car or a fire truck, it may be minutes, but it feels like hours. And the idea that nobody is coming is a feeling of an enormous hopelessness, and the idea that we can continue to send resources to help Puerto Rico reminds the folks down there that we love them, we support them, and they're part of the American fabric, and we're going to continue to treat them that way. And then the final piece is that we need to establish relationships in Puerto Rico in order to really commit to a long-term study of recovery, so that we really can start to tease out the characteristics of recovery. Therefore, we can start to walk that back into areas like response and mitigation. Because once we start to understand some of the building blocks better, we can restore faster, but we can restore and recover stronger than we have in the past. But it's an area that, if you look at the literature, if you look at the attention that is given in FEMA and even within our own state and localities, it's an area that is way understudied, underappreciated, and misunderstood.
I just want to say a word about recovery, because this is, I completely agree with what Bob just said, but so if you think of the spectrum of work around disasters, starting with prevention, mitigation, response, and recovery, recovery is the absolutely most neglected part of this spectrum. And part of it, where's that journalism student? Journalists do not know how to cover recovery. Because, if you're a CNN reporter and you can stand out there in hip boots in the driving rain, your hat's blowing off, and that's cool, and you're on TV. But once the cameras go away, and the front page, the A1 writers leave, you're left to an occasional feature story, oh, this family's not doing well, 3 years later, or whatever it is. That's unfortunate. And one of the things I would hope for is that American journalists will get a lot more comfortable figuring out how to cover recovery, because when the spotlights are gone, the cameras are off, and the main reporters aren't there, it becomes orphaned in terms of news. And part of the reality is it's very difficult to cover it. You have to follow the money, as we used to say. When $44 or $48 billion were allocated for recovery after Superstorm Sandy, that $48 billion federal asset was distributed among 18 different federal agencies. Some got very little, HUD got a lot, et cetera, but 18 different federal agencies. That went from there to an equivalent number of state agencies in New Jersey and New York for the most part. And it went from there to local jurisdictions. And in that process, it was indecipherable where that money was, what it was doing, how fast it was working, was it efficient, was it effective, and nobody to this day can give you an accountability of that. Again, it's you and your colleagues. Please bring that message back to your school.
So what I'd like to do, since we're just about out of time, and I want to hear the four voices that are at the microphone, if it's okay, we'll take turns, hear the question or comment that you have. We won't respond immediately. We'll get all four on the table, and then I'll go down the panel. We'll start with President Rodriguez, work our way this way, and you can choose to either answer one of the four questions or make any closing comments that you like, if that's okay.
Sounds like a memory test that we're going to fail, but okay. All right.
I'm writing. I don't know about that. So we'll start here and then go back and forth.
My name is Javier Cruz. I'm a student on the Uptown campus. I have family on the island. I have family on the mainland. I volunteer at the Puerto Rican Hispanic Youth Leadership Institute, and I know children who have relatives who have cancer and other very serious illnesses who went months without treatment in hospitals without electricity. There's very little historical precedent to suggest that Puerto Rico will receive more aid from the federal government, or that the United States has any interest in the welfare of Puerto Ricans on the mainland and on the island. I want to ask you, since there's no Puerto Rican PLO, there's no Puerto Rican IRA, when did the word liberation leave our vocabulary when talking about this discussion of recovering from the crisis that Maria caused, but the crisis that disaster capitalism caused over the last 100 years on the island?
Thank you. Let's go over here, please.
Wow, I'm wearing heels and this is still taller than me. But I'm Nina McInerney, and I'm a second semester freshman at U Albany. I actually came to this with a question already in mind, and the question, to sum it up, was how do we count the deaths? Are we just counting direct deaths, whether electrocution, drowning, etc., or are we counting disease and starvation and things that kind of happen over a prolonged period of time instead of right away? So I do believe that question was answered, but now as a follow-up question, I want to know a solution to that. Having the medical services be down at the time when it all happened, maybe not all deaths were recorded, and just things like that. So I was just wondering have any of you thought of ways that estimations and calculations could be more accurate so that the media can know about what's actually happening instead of there just being a ballpark guess on like what's going on down there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Allie. I'm also a journalism student at the University of Albany and Uptown campus, and I was wondering, just a question for all of you, there are multiple articles concerning the water that was just left on the runway for Puerto Rico, and I was wondering if any of you knew any information on that or knew anything, just any theories about it in general. So,
Thank you very much. Last word.
I'm David Turetsky. I'm on Bob's faculty.
Softball, David. Softball.
As I listened to the description of the exodus from Puerto Rico, I think about the fact that so much of critical infrastructure in the United States, and presumably every part of it, including Puerto Rico, is privately owned. It's not publicly owned, which means that the investment decisions of private companies, how much to rebuild and the like, matter a lot. And Puerto Rico being an island is a distinct market. And it's obviously not the attraction of New York City and northern New Jersey or southern New Jersey or whatever in terms of investment. So with people leaving, with the rest of recovery going so slow, the thing that I worry about, amongst all the other things to worry about, is how that money is going to be allocated and how those decisions, whether to rebuild and whether to invest by private companies, are going to be made, and whether you were talking about this before, what kind of accountability, because some of that money has to, in some fashion, end up in those private companies' hands, because whether Sprint rebuilds and AT&T rebuilds and others, those are private profit-making entities who will balance the investment decisions they make with building 5G networks in the continental United States and the rest anyway. So I'm curious how you see the recovery working given the sort of need for an interaction between the private sector and the public sector and the distinctively less attractive climate for investment that you're describing.
Thank you. I'll give each of the panelists the last word, and President Rodriguez, can we start with you, and we'll work our way down the panel?
Thank you. Some great questions. We could spend the entire evening answering all these questions, so we won't. But I wanted to say that all the issues that we've discussed here are embedded in a deep history, economic, political, socioeconomic history that Puerto Rico has been confronting for decades to come. Clearly, the recovery aspects for Puerto Rico will remain a challenge. Clearly, both the Commonwealth government and the federal government are going to have to step up to the plate to deal with these critical issues in terms of economic development. One of the things that is so promising is the overwhelming response that Puerto Rico received from throughout the United States and throughout the world, literally, trying to focus on the economic recovery efforts of Puerto Rico, and particularly the disaster relief efforts. It's important to highlight that if you spend 10% of what you spend in disaster relief, you spend 10% on disaster mitigation, you can avoid a lot of those expenses moving forward. But I want to really conclude by thanking the New York State Writers Institute, the Communications Journalism Program, and all of you for being here tonight. And I especially want to thank all of you that are here, that have been actively engaged in the recovery, response and recovery process in Puerto Rico. Whether you represent the State University of New York, SUNY, we have some colleagues here, where you represent the College of Emergency Preparedness, Homeland Security, Cybersecurity, where you represent other programs across the University at Albany, or a variety of other programs represented here, or whether you represent individuals and organizations that have been actively engaged in the response and recovery efforts. This is one of the highlights, right, that we like to focus on, because there is a lot of goodwill out there. There's great intentions to help the people of Puerto Rico and the other Caribbean islands that were also significantly impacted by Hurricane Maria, and we need much more of these concerted efforts to move the island and other communities forward. At the end of the day, what we need is significant economic investment, both in the public area, but particularly in the private area in Puerto Rico, to spur economic development. Yes, the future for Puerto Rico remains uncertain, but given the capacity of the people and the agencies represented throughout the continental United States responding, including the state of New York, to these issues in Puerto Rico, there's promise that we can recover from these devastating events.
Sean, any last word?
Well, I'm sorry to say that, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead, go ahead.
No, all right, I'm sorry for jumping. I wasn't.
You're brilliant, so go ahead.
Now, the accountability. Unfortunately, there were two mayors in small towns or municipalities in Puerto Rico, and this happened before the hurricane, where they misappropriated millions of dollars that was granted to them by the federal government. And, that's what hurts the the people in Puerto Rico, when you have that type of accountability, the accountability in Puerto Rico, then unfortunately this administration is like you see. And it's sad to know that the mayors of those two small municipalities did what they did. So, you can't, you have your positive and your negative, and it's very embarrassing that they did that.
Thank you. Sean?
Yeah. And so thanks for just like attending this today. I think it's very helpful. I learned a lot from the audience and from the speakers. I think that a couple things I want to for the take-home message for the public health is, I think that in Puerto Rico, Maria, we should definitely, for public health point of view, we should definitely have like the monitor or long-term surveillance system to look at like the disease, especially for like the respiratory disease, and because the more problems, so we should watch the asthma, like the COPD, and also the cardiovascular disease, and especially for mental health. I think we found that after Hurricane Sandy, the effects last for 2, 3, and 4 years. So the disease rate still just like keeping higher compared to the control group. So this tells us definitely for public health, I don't know how can we put out the resources, but I definitely think about the local government, and I think that the federal government should put some effort to like monitor the health outcomes over time.
Thank you. Bob?
So let me shotgun a couple of quick answers. The issue of the counting of deaths according to the storm is really complex, and we're actually still counting the deaths from the 9/11 attacks. So that is definitely an inexact science. However, I will tell you that it is way more than what the administration was trying to claim as a way of smoothing the waters. Second point about the multiple bottles of water on the tarmac of the airport, that happens. What happens is that as elements of the logistics stream catch up to each other, all of the pieces aren't in place. So as the airport gets up and running, we're able to make more dumps, we're able to bring more resources in, but then that last mile of logistics becomes where you have real problems of actually how do you get that material from the airport, from the ports, into the hands of the people that need them, and logistics is really, really hard to do. So I'm not at all surprised that there's probably still multiple bottles of water at the airport. I worked in Arlington County before I went to the Department of Homeland Security. In 2007, we still had piles of lumber from the 2001 attack at the Pentagon. So it gives you a sense sometimes of how long things can sit. The issue of recovery and how it's working, David, I think is a really interesting question. We're going to have to keep studying. I think one of the things the federal government could do in all future disasters is actually have a group of trained planners that can go in and help work with communities and state governments in order to jumpstart that process of recovery, particularly with the private sector. Because good planning as quickly as you can will help both the response and the long-term recovery.
Thanks, Bob. And Erwin, as you're given the last word, I'm going to invite Paul to come back up to adjourn us after that. But Erwin,
good, thanks. I just want to also comment about the private sector. Who was asking about that? Was it somebody? Yeah. So this is actually a really, really important challenge, and you remember the BP oil spill, of course. So the president appointed Thad Allen, who was the head of the Coast Guard, to oversee the process of fixing the leak and whatever the recovery was. Except that all of the real expertise was actually at BP, the organization, the private sector organization that his equipment had failed. And there's a very interesting dysfunctional symbiotic relationship between private and public sector when it comes to prevention of, mitigation of, response to, and recovery from disasters. Yet I've been in countless tabletop exercises and other events where the private sector is actually not at the table, or if they are, it's very superficial, drop-in presence. But when the actual hardcore planning is coming, the actual expertise is usually, at least in the settings that I've been in, not there in sufficient quantity or quality of engagement. The governor here asked me to head one of the panels that was looking at the after action post Sandy. And we did that, and at one point he said to me, he said, so how am I going to prevent another gas shortage with another event like Sandy? And I said, well, you have limited ability to do so. That oil is drilled by private companies, it's refined by private companies, it's transported by private companies through multiple states, and then it's sold by gas stations that are privately owned. So your ability as a very high-level government official is limited into what you can do. And if you really want to understand how we can prevent another oil crisis, you got to be arm in arm with the private sector elements that are very powerful. They control 80%, as you referred to, of the infrastructure in the United States, and it's delusional to think that the federal government or state or any government can magically, without a incomprehensibly vast disaster where we had really national disaster or emergency where we had to really nationalize everything. But in the meantime, for everything that you can expect in our lifetime, we are going to need to have a much more cohesive and effective partnership between the private sector and the public sector for every aspect of dealing with disasters. So it's a really good point. How we get there, I don't know. And I think that there's a lot of resistance in various government agencies, and maybe at some point Bob could give me a lesson on this, but there's a resistance. If you're not in us, if you're not within this group, if you're not working for my agency, what are you doing here exactly? And I think it's a strange situation. I think people have talked about, we've tried to address it, but we got a lot of work to do there. I'm a special advisor to de Blasio on emergency response, and even I'm there with the authority of the mayor, and it's like after 5 or 6 years, I'm still kind of a little outsider, which I'm aware of. But is that fixable? Oh, never mind. You don't have to do it. Anyway.
So I want to thank everyone for being part of this tonight, for your donations to aid the recovery of Puerto Rico. Remind you that you can join us next door in the Levitt Room to continue to ask questions of our panelists. But tonight taught me the most important takeaway to me was the quality of our UAlbany students. The 100 who gave up their summer vacation, winter breaks, to go do the hard work on this damaged island, and also the brilliant students that asked the best questions tonight, including our future journalists. So we're 175 years old. I think our future is very bright. Let's thank our UAlbany students who came out tonight, and our panelists, Avidan Rodriguez, Xiao Lin, Bob Griffin, Michelle Centeno, Erwin Redlener, and our moderator, David Holtgrave. Thanks for coming tonight. Join us next door. Thank you.